Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for those of you who have just joined us. As usual, we're going to be waiting 1 or 2 minutes to give others a chance to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. We're just going to wait 1 more minute, and then we'll get the webinar started. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can get started. And thank you all so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening for you. We've assembled quite an international panel to join you on this webinar, and I'm sure the audience is equally international. Today, this is the final part of our series on sharing the findings from our Global Wind Workforce Outlook, covering the period of 2023 to 2027. This is a report that's produced on an annual basis by the Global Wind Organization and by the Global Wind Energy Council. And we are lucky to have colleagues from both organizations as well as industry stakeholders join us today to talk about the report's findings with a particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region. So it's the third of the series that we've done flybys of the Americas as well as EMEA, and now we're ending our series on APAC with a bang. We do want to foster a discussion during this webinar. So at any point, if you have questions for any of the panelists that you see coming on the microphone, or any of the findings that we'll be sharing with you shortly in the presentation section, please do use the Q&A button on the bottom ribbon of your Zoom window, and you'll be able to enter your question there. We will all see it, and we'll be able to take that during the panel discussion portion of the webinar. Next slide, please. So we have a great lineup of speakers joining us today. I'm just going to go round in a clockwise format and introduce everyone by name, role, and organization. First, we have Andrea Scassola, who's the Business Analytics Manager at the Global Wind Organization. And then myself, I'll be hosting today. So I'm Joyce Lee. I'm Head of Policy and Projects at the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. I'm joined by my colleague, Anjali Lathigara, who's Lead Market Intelligence of APAC at GWEC. We have Vicky Hsu, who's Sales Lead at Taiwan International Wind Power Training Corporation. We have my colleague, Liang Wanliang, who is the China Director at GWEC as well. And then finally, last but not least, we have Clara Moura Santos, who is Vice President of Operations and Maintenance at Principal Power. So spanning Europe to India, China, and Taiwan, we have many stakeholders gathered with us today. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today's webinar is as such. We're going to begin with a background, sharing the objectives of the Global Wind Workforce Outlook, and then providing a brief overview of the context, why these two organizations are working together on an annual basis for this workforce report. And then Andrea will share the findings from this year's report. So we'll do a forward-looking forecast of training needs across different segments of the supply chain, with a particular focus on the APAC region and a look at entry-level needs. And then we'll hand it to my colleague Anjali, who will provide a policy outlook on China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Australia to provide some background on what are the drivers for wind growth in generally in these markets. Following the presentations, we'll then move into a panel format, and we'll be able to take your questions. We'll be able to probe perspectives across the panel on this year's report findings. So before I hand it to Andrea, once again, please do make use of that Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll be sure to take your questions near to the end of the agenda here. With that, I'm going to hand it to Andrea to take over and walk us through the report.
Thank you for the introduction, Joyce, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to just start by spending a few words on why we believe it's useful to forecast the wind workforce in scope for industry standard training. The reason is essentially twofold. On the one hand, we want to improve visibility, because visibility helps training providers allocate the supply capacity where and when it's needed. On the other hand, we also want to help align expectations across different stakeholders so that there is a correct match between demand and supply. Today, we want to answer essentially 4 questions. What's the size of the technician workforce in the next 5 years? How many people today have a training certificate that is valid and in line with industry standards? How many people need specific training in the APAC region, which is the region in scope today? And what are the main drivers of demand for workforce in each sub-region? In this case, we take China, Asia excluding China, and Oceania. And finally, with Anjali, we will focus on China, India, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. So in the wind industry, workforce is employed throughout many phases of project development, but industry standard training takes place essentially for work carried out during construction installation and the operation and maintenance. Our forecast exclude the workforce from other segments of the wind project lifecycle, such as research and development, procurement, also manufacturing, which is traditionally the most labor-intensive segment, at least in certain key markets. And also transport and decommissioning are outside of scope of this report. The result of the model is essentially the number of wind technicians who need to be ready for construction, installation, and operation and maintenance of the global fleet, both onshore and offshore. These numbers also reflect the total number of people who will need a valid safety and technical training and skills during the outlook period. The data foundation of the forecast are essentially GWEC's capacity forecast, both annual and cumulative, inputs on turbine ratings, project level data for both onshore and offshore wind projects. The data are then combined with inputs on the typical workforce needed for onshore and offshore wind on a people per turbine basis, which we estimate with real project data sourced from our member network. Then once we derive the number of operational turbines and the number of new turbines installed each year, we multiply it by the respective people per turbine ratio, and finally we obtain the number of people needed to build and service the wind assets across the world. GWEC needs no introduction. It produces industry-leading market forecast and expects that almost 700 gigawatts will be added in the world in the next 5 years. This installation activity should lead up to an installed base of 1.6 terawatt by 2027, the end of 2027. Since we focus on the workforce that works both on construction and installation and O&M, we use both forecasts as input to our model calculations. So let's look at both. Workforce dynamics follow different patterns depending on the stage of project development. So since the cumulative capacity on the left typically grows incrementally, demand for O&M technicians grow in a linear way and without major fluctuations. On the other hand, if you look at the right-hand graph, demand for technicians involved in construction installation is much more volatile because it follows the annual installation trends. Throughout the outlook, there are efficiency gains that are associated with the increase in turbine ratings. Typically, the number of people involved in the construction and the maintenance of a turbine do not vary significantly based on the size of the machine. Therefore, as the outlook progresses, machines with higher ratings will tend to slow down the increase in the total number of people that are needed on a per megawatt basis. The global wind technician workforce is expected to increase by 17% over the next 5 years. Onshore wind additions increase at a stable annual rate, and therefore the demand for onshore wind technicians required for construction installation remains flat year over year. By contrast, if we look at offshore wind additions, we see that they grow quicker on a year-on-year basis, and therefore demand for the technicians involved in offshore wind construction will grow much more rapidly. O&M tends to grow steadily together with a cumulative fleet, and this counts for both onshore and offshore quite equally. Overall, we can see that offshore wind will grow faster, but by the end of the outlook period, onshore wind will still have represent the bulk of the workforce. Looking at the APAC region, the first thing we can see is that installations in China during 2022 were very low. The reason is that the phase out of the central FIT subsidies caused a boom concentrated in 2020 and a bust in 2021 and 2022. And as a result, new wind power additions will pick up again in China in 2023, and then will remain stable throughout the end of the outlook. Therefore, it will be development in Asia, excluding China, and Oceania that will drive steady demand for wind workforce in the short to medium term. Roughly half of the wind workforce needed globally is needed in China. However, demand for workforce in China will increase at a slower pace than in the rest of the world, and will move to emerging markets, including in the rest of Asia and Oceania. So we estimate that more than 300,000 people will need training to build and maintain onshore and offshore wind assets. Workforce growth in the onshore construction installation segment will decrease, and this is the result of steady capacity additions combined with higher turbine ratings in China. On the other hand, construction activity will drive up demand for construction workforce, predominantly offshore. Also, demand for workforce will grow steadily in the O&M segment, and this will happen across all subregions. Looking only at entry-level workers, there are two forces that drive demand for entry-level workers. One is demand for wind power, and therefore demand for entry-level workers is heavily pegged to year-over-year market growth. The other force for entry-level workforce is attrition. The attrition is understood as the percentage of people in scope for industry standard training that leave the industry every year, and therefore it needs replacing. So attrition rates across the wind industry are estimated at around 6%. That means that on average, each year during the next 5 years, more than 27,000 workers in scope for GWO training in the Asia Pacific region will need to be entry-level workers And this needs to be taken into account when creating training standards and training programs that are suited to them. Throughout the outlook, 75, 3/4 of them will be in China. As you remember from earlier, demand for workers in China decreased that drastically in 2021 as a result of this huge surge in installations that occurred in 2020. So this caused a sharp increase in technicians, in the number of technicians needed in 2022 and 2023. And that was needed to prepare the capacity that is scheduled to come online in 2023 and 2024. So this will have an impact on demand for new workers, which will decline in 2023 and 2024 to then stabilize towards the back end of the outlook period that we consider. The workforce in scope for industry standard training in China is much larger than that in the rest of Asia and Oceania, as you can see from the left-hand graph. However, you can also see that adoption of GWO training is much higher in the rest of Asia and Oceania, especially in India, Taiwan, Australia, and Japan. The reasons are associated with the incentive in taking GWO training. GWO training is ideal for international projects, meaning complex projects carried out by players from different countries who need to talk a common safety language and also reduce complexity. And this is definitely the case for large offshore wind development, for example, in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. And the other reason is associated to the footprint of GWO members. So members who have a vested interest in standardizing safety and technical training across the industry. And this market footprint is definitely higher in Asia, excluding China, and in Oceania than it is in China. Also, we should not forget that China is largely a market developed as an environment for domestic players with its own safety standards and technical standards. So much of the incentive of taking GWO training for Chinese players lies primarily in project development that takes place outside of China as part of the development agenda and export agenda of several Chinese OEM, for examples. Every year, we try to develop GWO training capabilities in key markets that are of interest to our members. And this year, as you can see, was no exception. Together with the Danish Embassy in Korea and the Korea Institute of Ocean Science and Technology, we organized the Wind Workforce Masterclass in Busan. The goal was to essentially facilitate new partnerships between existing GWO training providers and several organizations with an interest in adding GWO standards to their training curriculum in Korea. We were also present in the Global Offshore Wind Summit in Kitakyushu in Japan, where we signed an MOU with the GWPA, the Japanese Wind Power Association. And this agreement lays the foundations to describe the knowledge, skills, and abilities that entry-level wind technicians need to have in Japan, and how GWO will contribute to make it a reality. With this being said, I now leave the floor to Anjali from GWEC for an overview of the wind power markets in APAC, and more specifically in China, Japan, Korea, India, and Australia.
Thanks, Andrea. I think you have set a very good foundation for me to explain China and also how GWEC is kind of overlooking its APAC wind outlook. But in this slide, I would like to highlight why we are focusing on 5 specific markets. China, of course, everybody knows it's but top leading market involved in terms of not only installations, but also the manufacturing for wind turbine generators. But along with India and Australia, it will be giving us 58% share of wind additions in next 5 years. And of course, the South Korea, Japan, and Australia are one of the emerging markets within APEC, and specifically for offshore wind, to mention. So this chart gives a very good highlight in terms of how APEC is leading with 63% of share in terms of new wind installation addition in next 5 years. We can go to next slide, and I would like to focus more on China. Yeah, thank you. So as I said, Andrea, you have mostly covered why wind installations will be growing up, and what were the reasons post COVID. But here I would like to highlight why China continues to be the world's largest leading wind market. Of course, it has the ambitious commitment, which is like 30-60 pledge. So peak emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It has almost started its 14th five-year plan since 2022, which also means that the feed-in tariff mechanism, which was driving the wind installations in previous years, is kind of removed, and grid parity mechanism is now onwards adopted for wind installations. Of course, there are a few provincial states which are still giving its financial support for wind installation in those regions. Not to mention, it is the leading wind manufacturing hub in world. Almost 60 to 70% of share it covers for the national production, and also the key other wind turbine components. Since COVID has ended, and there were a few restrictions after that, so 2022 was still one of the best years in terms of installations. But its National Energy Administration kind of predicted that it will be kind of doubling its wind and solar generation from 2020 levels by 2025, which means like almost 250 to 300 onshore wind additions in next 5 years, and more than 60 gigawatt for offshore wind in next 5 years. The another major driver I would like to mention for offshore wind will be the Chinese wind industries initiative, which was kind of launched during Global Offshore Wind Summit in China, which was co-organized by GWEC, which called for 100 gigawatt offshore wind in China by 2025, 200 gigawatt by 2030, and 1,000 gigawatt by 2050. So this number shows a larger and huge ambitions moving forward. So it kind of almost translates why the wind workforce needs will be in high growth. In this chart, we saw that it is marginally higher, but the stable wind growth will be adding up the wind workforce needed in next 5 years. With this, I would like to now focus on India in next slide. Yeah, so again, India is a fourth largest leading market in terms of the onshore wind installations annually. This is profoundly kind of driven after 2014, when new government took its role, and it is more focused on clean energy and economical upliftment within the country. For onshore wind, it has the 140 gigawatt a medium-term target to be achieved by 2030, and it kind of is having 37 gigawatt auction trajectory plan which is from 2023 to 2030. This will help us in a way to meet its target of 30 gigawatt offshore wind by 2030, not in terms of installation, but in terms of awarding the capacity, and then we will be seeing the installation moving on from 2028 onwards. But GWEC still forecasts that that in the next 5 year span, the initial demonstration capacity of 20 megawatts will be seen in 2026. For onshore wind, of course, there are few drivers and challenges. I would like to mention that it's legacy kind of attractive mechanism called e-reverse auction mechanism is now converted into the closed envelope bidding. So from 2022 onwards, the projects will be awarded through closed envelope bidding. This is mainly to kind of stop the unrealistic low cost bidding by the developers. This will be again driven by the 10 gigawatt annual auction targets set up by MNRE. So the forecast you see is driven by that driver as well. There are certain policy incentives for onshore, and we will be seeing the viability gap funding and the interstate transmission charges waiver kind of incentives for offshore wind for first few projects, and then later on the other policy incentives such as additional surcharge cancellations under the various policies. Now, India is also having National Green Hydrogen Mission, which we are seeing as additional driver for the wind energy development moving forward from 2027 onwards as well. Last to mention is that under the China Plus One strategy that we are kind of seeing in talks very much, the India is kind of seen as second largest manufacturing export hub within APAC. So this will be giving another a push for the industry. Now moving on, I would like to focus on Japan, which is having a sixth longest coastline in world. This means the massive uncaptured offshore wind potential, specifically floating offshore wind in its deep waters. GWEC kind of helped the country through the cost reduction recovery plan, and this kind of led to for country to make its offshore wind targets, which are 10 gigawatt by 2030, 30 to 45 gigawatt by 2040. And this implies that annual tender allocation has to rise from average 1 gigawatt to 4 gigawatt from 2026. There are certain kind of barriers we are seeing in terms of permitting and clearances, also the site identification and the site allocation along the bidding rounds. So this has to be, our industry is seeing that this has to be resolved very soon. In terms of supporting its offshore wind industry, it is having a very good initiative to also establish local offshore wind manufacturing base. And that's why in the forecast chart, we are seeing a good growing wind additions. And also this means that almost the workforce needs will be doubled from 2022 numbers to 2027. Moving on quickly to South Korea and Australia in the next slides. South Korea has the kind of potential to replace Japan in top 5 countries in terms of the floating offshore wind installation. It is already having 6.7 gigawatt capacity of floating offshore wind under the permitting process, and if there are not really huge delays, this can replace the Japan in the APAC and the world. GWEC forecast that considering the onshore wind dynamics, it will be adding 1 gigawatt in next 5 years and 2.3 gigawatt offshore wind additions from 2023 to 2027. One of the good kind of driver is that South Korea has removed its electric business license based permitting, and now it is moving on the one-stop shop kind of approach to fasten its permitting process, which will take time to kind of in terms of implementation as well. But there is a lack of policy and regulatory kind of clarity which will be required for the stable offshore wind growth in the country. Lastly, but not the least, on Australia, it is again another emerging market, not in terms of only onshore, offshore, but also the hydrogen, green hydrogen, which will be very additional driver for the wind additions in the next decades to come. For onshore wind, the corporate PPA market and the very good auction pipeline kind of discovered by the various states are driving the onshore wind additions, and this in translation we are seeing the growing growth for onshore wind, which is 11 gigawatt will be added in next 5 years. As I said, it is doing very good on offshore wind, and it is in the starting phase and kind of having very good developments in terms of establishing the permitting and the other site identification processes in place. Of course, there is not a national target, but several states are coming up or under the process to set up the target. And government has already announced several zones to allocate for offshore wind exploration in the country. With this, I would like to end, and I will like to hand over it to Joyce back here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anjali and Andrea, for the very comprehensive presentations that provided perfect backdrop for this discussion, and right on time as well, so we can dedicate the next 30 minutes to fostering some thoughts among this group on the report. I'd like to now bring in the panelists and invite them to turn their cameras on. So again, we have Andrea from GWO, Anjali from GWEC, both of whom we just heard from, Vicky from TIWTC in Taiwan, Wanliang, China Director at GWEC in Beijing, and Clara Moura Santos, currently in Portugal as VP O&M for Principal Power. And Vicky, I'd like to turn to you first. And just get a sense as a training provider based in Taiwan of what you're seeing in terms of the growing interest from potential workers or existing workers in participating in training courses, in refreshing their training qualifications. What trends are you seeing in terms of growing enrollment in Taiwan in the last few years? And if you have any observations from East Asia, like Japan and South Korea, that would also be interesting.
Thank you, Joyce. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let me briefly introduce about the training growing situation in Taiwan. Like in the past few years, in the beginning, there is still we don't have on the same page about which training standard we should follow. So in the very beginning, we still struggling is OPITO or GWO. That is a good training standard for our workforce in Taiwan. Then with the growth of offshore wind and more and more companies, they are accounted and follow GWO standard, especially as everyone may know, lots of companies come from like Europe, and they are all GWO members. So also another point is in beginning of 2019, our occupational health OSA, or Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they release a safety guideline for offshore workforce, and they put GWO training into the safety guideline as a recommendation recommend training for our workforce. So far, at the time, GWO is one of the most important training in Taiwan offshore. So the more new challenge we meet in Taiwan as a provider now is how to combine the training required by local regulation and GWO training efficiently. And I think this problem will be faced in every market, every country. And also, we are following more and more new course GWO release that probably be more task specific. So if not wild like BST, and how to make every training courses available, how to co-work with other training providers, like we team up and we not only Taiwan, like in Asia, how every training centers can work together to provide these kind of new centers as much available for everyone. That will be a new topic for us to discuss. So I'm look forward to it. Then because I spent over 2 years in developing and understanding Japan market, so what I saw is we mentioned about like installation capacity. I would say yes, training definitely followed by the capacity and the pipeline. But in Japan, there is a very it's like a very wide and a big land, and the wind farm is located in lots of places. It's far away. So how to set up the training centers or training facilities and to dedicate to every prefecture it will be a new like, well, we may provide some solutions, like in my personal opinion, we hope it can be like medium size and economical, and it can be held as small as possible in different near wind farm. Then the wind farm workforce, they can take the training near, because traffic cost or the traffic time in Taiwan and in Japan and Korea might be much more than in Taiwan. That's what I saw. And another point is in Taiwan, in Japan, there's many onshore wind energy. So I think there's still some shortage of training facilities, especially the sea survival one. So I think the following few years, there should be more sea survival training facility in these two markets. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicky. So it sounds like lots of opportunities to get ahead of the training needs curve based on collaboration, better planning when it comes to proximity to demand centers, and making sure that standards are harmonized. I'd like to pick up on the capacity and pipeline part of the equation, or you could say the demand side part of the equation for workforce needs, and turn to Wanliang and Clara around project timelines that we see in the Asia Pacific region, and whether there is enough certainty around meeting commissioning deadlines for onshore offshore wind projects that you see in APAC, for training needs to be anticipated in advance. Wanliang, maybe we can start with you on China, and then we can move to Clara.
Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, as Andrea mentioned, that China is the biggest single market that basically it accounts for about 40% of the global installation. And also in China, there is already a very strong supply chain which can supply like 60% or 70% of the turbines and also the key components. But that's a year that the new installation was a little bit low, and also the first half of this year. But yeah, as Anjali mentioned, that is basically because of the phase out of the subsidy for onshore and offshore. But we now we can see some signals that the market will pick up very soon and back to around 60 gigawatts per year in the next few years. Last week, we just had this year's China wind power in Beijing. We can feel that the temperature, the heat is still there, and we had over 100,000 visitors to this event, which is a record. So basically, the market is still very strong, and as Anjali mentioned, that the government already set very clear targets for future development, so which is very promising. But I think for the China's wind industry, it has turned from fast developing to kind of a high quality developing stage, which means we may not have a very high increase of the workforce in the next years, but we do need high quality and well-trained workforce for the industry. I know that GWO already has some footprint in China already, but we need many more. I had a talk with Goldwind, the leading OEM in China, that they have a very good offshore training center in Jiangsu province, which is in cooperation with GWO. And the director of that training center told me that the program, it's very attractive. Now if you want to have a training course, join the training course, you need to wait in long queue. Yeah, so I think the potential and the demand is there. And also last week we released an announcement about to build a more resilient and stable supply chain, of the industry, which means that the industry should spend more time and money into training, and also to keep a good quality, and also for safety and health of the workforce. So that's basically will be the kind of goal for the next years. So I think the market potential is there, and we do need a lot of more kind of training courses in China. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Wanliang. Very clear that the outlook is optimistic on China, recovering from the slight downswing period of the last few years, but very strong growth ahead, and that means scaling up training facilities as well. Clara, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, just picking up a little bit on what Wanliang has mentioned, for us, and really from an operator perspective, almost the training standardization is really key and fulcral for the development of the industry, right? It creates a benchmark for safety, it creates a common language for safety, which ultimately minimizes the inefficiencies and decreases OPEX during the operational phase of projects, right? And OPEX decrease, inefficiency minimization are absolutely key for the development of the industry. Yeah. The risk of not achieving enough training for what the ambitions are in terms of deployments is really that we start finding alternatives less efficient, less of a common language, just for the sake of closing gaps that will exist, right? So for me, and straight back to your question, all over Asia, we see a massive pipeline coming up as early as 2030, right? The ambition is really, really big. And if you think about the ambition, for example, for offshore wind, we're saying Japan 10 gigawatt by 2030, South Korea 14.2 by 2030. It's a lot of offshore installations, right? If you're thinking about the generic 15 megawatt turbines, which should be probably the case by 2030, you're talking about like 1,000 units in the water by 2030, right? Just in Korea. And then there's Japan, similar numbers, and all over Asia, similar numbers, right? So naturally, this won't come everything live on 2030, right? If the ambition is 2030, it means that projects could be coming offshore online just as soon as 2026 or 2027, right? So it is true that we are seeing a trend of project delays due to all that is going on around the world. But I don't know that not meeting these targets is on the table, right? Because that would compromise the global commitment for decarbonization, right? So there will be a solution, and these projects will be coming on live. As such, are we still in time? And are these delays affecting the training requirements? Not yet, but the effort needs to start now. I think it's imminent. We need to start now. We see already from reading the report, GWEC's report, we see already a few initiatives in the APAC area, you know, where you see class societies, CLAF&K, coming in with partnerships with the global stakeholders, key stakeholders, Mars training, GWF work. That's all really good initiatives, but we probably need more. And the timing is now for me.
Great. Thanks so much, Clara. So we shouldn't let policy barriers hold back the workforce planning needs in these markets. And in the report, we take a deeper look at the market-by-market policy barriers from permitting to grid availability. Just stepping back even further in terms of how we can achieve this scale up of workers, because as Wanliang pointed out, there's clearly demand for it. Now there's a queue to sign up to these courses. And it's about ensuring that we have enough facilities available. Let's look at those who are in the queue. And Andrea gave us an interesting perspective of the entry-level technician needs that we'll see during the forecast period. I'm wondering, across the region, there's some major oil and gas producing countries. Are we identifying any reskilling opportunities to bring in workers from incumbent fossil fuel sectors, which may be ramping down their workforce needs, or what we call sunset industries, and bringing them into a sector which is ramping up, wind energy? This one is really an open floor for those who have thoughts on a reskilling opportunity. So I'll look to our speakers to see if anyone would like to take that one.
I can kick off on this one, and then maybe someone else can follow up. I see the reskilling market, let's call it like that, it has a huge potential here, right? So I think there's innumerous amount of synergies between other industries where APAC is actually really strong in. So if we think, for example, just to give a few examples, electrical and electronical industry, right? This is going to be key for commissioning and manufacturing all of those electrical systems, electrical components, control systems, which, for example, for floating offshore wind are absolute key parts of the asset. If we think about already existing onshore renewable competence, naturally that can be easily transferred to offshore industry. Every industry, manufacturing, very powerful in APAC region. All of that, if you think about the requirements for in-service inspections, there's a lot of competence that would go aligned with what the people hold by working in this heavy industry and manufacturing. How to inspect assets, being certified visual inspectors, having NDT techniques course and certification, right? All of that, it's still applicable, right, during the in-service inspections of assets. I mean, there's the natural and the most obvious one, which is other energy and power generation sources, oil and gas, coal, I don't know, all very relevant for the power distribution and grid integration network, for example. IT, data analytics area, during the operational phase, a big part of this is about data, receiving data, treating data, generating intelligence out of operational data, right? All of this is really relevant. So anyone with this kind of skill set would be very relevant to work in the industry. But last and not least, I think that also the fisheries play quite an important role here, because fisheries, fishermen in particular, hold a quite extensive knowledge on metocean and navigation, as well as, you know, like mechanical, from repairing their boats, electronical or electric skills. And all of this is very, very applicable to offshore, right? Either if it's maintaining the assets, even if it's taking care of, for example, people transfer, you know, by CTVs, you know, having a deep understanding of the sea and the metocean conditions, it's a key aspect of what we call accessibility. So being able to go offshore and access the asset for maintenance. And there's a lot of knowledge and know-how within the fishery community.
That's a very compelling insight, because as we know, the fishing industry can be a challenge for increasing social acceptance and ensuring efficient permitting for offshore wind projects across the region, especially in Japan and South Korea. So it's about turning that barrier into a potential opportunity, and to bring in workers from these industry into the wind energy sector.
Joyce, if I may just a quick note would be that if there are jobs during the construction installation that are more medium term, O&M, it's really on the long run, right? It's for the total lifetime of the asset. These are very technical, well-paid jobs, so it's worth the investment in the transition as well of the knowledge of the people.
Yeah, very, very well made point. And in the report, we average I think a 25-year asset lifetime. And so indeed, this is it's a career for life for those who are able to.
As a minimum, yeah.
I'd like to bring in Andrea because we're starting to address now how we can create new models to recruit, attract workers into the sector. And you highlighted some work that GWO is doing to move into Japan and South Korea. So maybe you can speak a little bit about how the approach is going in APAC versus other regions in terms of ensuring workforce training facilities can scale up.
I can make a couple of examples that are similar to each other, even though they come from different regions. And they have a common problem as a background, which is that today companies in the wind sector are experiencing a huge labor shortage, and companies within the industry often end up cannibalizing each other's workforce. So the key effort that we need to take here is to expand the workforce pool so that the workforce will be available when it's needed and where it's needed. So we need to transition to a model where hiring and bringing technicians up to speed is much more quicker and efficient. And in pretty much all markets, we have seen this common need to set standards and standard requirements for entry-level technicians. So we have initiated a strong collaboration with American Clean Power on the one hand, and in the US, and also with the GWPA, the Japanese Wind Power Association, and to set the minimum requirements for what entry-level technicians, what kind of skills they need to have. And the most important aspect, I believe, of these initiatives is that they are great learning opportunities for local industries and for the members of those associations. It's a great opportunity to draw from best practices that are available globally to accelerate the development of new training models. And for us, because we can also learn the challenges associated to adopting GWO in a specific context, and then adapting GWO training as a result.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. I want to come back in a second on the benefits of standardizing training qualifications. But first, to turn to Anjali, And maybe you can reflect on the government perspective here, although you don't represent government. I think this is a missing piece because industry can't do it alone. And the workforce roadmaps that are required should happen in tandem with policymakers. And do you think policymakers in the region are recognizing the urgency of ensuring that a trained workforce is ready to deploy to meet their transition targets?
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. And I think building on what Andrea just said, what GW is doing, there's other couple of examples wherein we are seeing in Japan several MOUs with Maersk and Class NK being formed. But in terms of the policy reflections, how they are seeing workforce demand is available. I think several examples in terms of investment. Say, for example, in America, the Inflation Reduction Act kind of ensures that there is a budget and investment for job creation, and looking at it, the European Union, initially the EU Green Deal was not kind of considering how it will be forecasting or ensuring the wind workforce is available for meeting its huge target. But now there are several amendments and the budget allocated, which kind of ensures that that will be focusing on training the workforce and making sure the trained and qualified workers are available. But in several other markets, we see that there are gaps in terms of forming the policy, which kind of lacks in considering how it will be met through right skilled persons. And this is also highlighted in this report. Of course, there are government programs. Say, for example, in India, the National Institute of Wind Energy, NIWE, is kind of conducting the annual Vayumitra skilling program, but it doesn't get reflected in the policy or the targets, how that will be achieved through right job creation. So certainly there is a gap in markets, and it has to be reflected in terms of the policy or the roadmap development, how and when the wind workforce will be available to meet those targets.
Thanks, Anjali. And I think we have 3 more minutes, but I want to come back to Wanliang and then Vicky, because when we look at policy targets, I mean, no market in the region is as prominent as China here when it comes to scale and the deliverability of targets as well, because I think the targets that are being set are even going to be exceeded ahead of schedule. And I think this raises the question around the supply and demand in the region when it comes to workers, and whether China having a lot of demand at the moment, potential overcapacity to meet its pipeline, provides an opportunity for meeting the growing needs for workers across the region. Of course, that's a tricky question to ask, because the wind industry is all about local value creation and transforming communities and providing jobs locally. But Wanliang, how are you seeing this, the capacity in China starting to move beyond its borders potentially?
Right. 2 simple comments here. For local governments in China, that they have the strong need to create kind of a cluster, especially for offshore wind, that in their own province, that basically it can create jobs and also GDP to local government. So that's the interest, and also for regional cooperation. I think after close to 2 decades development, that China now have a very comprehensive supply chain, but also a lot of experience to share with neighbor countries like Southeast Asia and also other regions. I'm talking about offshore. That I think it's true that China's industry can have a lot of assistance for the neighbor countries to have in their offshore development. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Wanliang. And I think it's something that we need to keep a close eye on, of course, because we want targets to be met. We want the transition to be delivered. At the same time, we need to ensure, the benefits are equitable across the board, and we are uplifting domestic markets, local communities as we expand the industry. So maybe something for next year's report. But Vicky, I'm going to come to you and give you the final word. You had the first word of the panel discussion, and you're going to get the last word, and offer you an opportunity to reflect on the discussion that we've had today, and in particular, I think where we could strengthen the benefits around standardization when it comes to shortening training pathways, and when it comes to scaling up availability of training facilities and training courses to folks, so that the standardization aspect and how we can rally together to focus on that. Yeah, Vicky, over to you.
Okay, so I think it's my free time here because I'm the last one. Okay, so I think for me, I have the last 1 minute. Actually, I want to add another. My personal opinion is Clara mentioned about there might have a lot of opportunity to bring the young talent or the talent there, or also the fishermen into the workforce industry, and how to bring them. I think the GWO training is a very important role in it. That from my personally, I visit some like college professor or high school student teachers, and they want to provide the environment for the young talent to get ready to enter the industry, but how, they don't know, they have no ideas. So what I am work hard for is I use GWO training as a beginning, as a standard, to bring the link together, the local education and the global standard, and they work together to go into the offshore industry. That's what I want, so it happened. So for me personally, I really expect in the following, maybe next year, we can have some like demonstration of entry level wind technicians program to implicate with Japanese school, especially you may know there is lots of Senmon means vocational school. They're only 2 years and they are ready for work after graduate. So I think it will be great if we can show this kind of cooperation, work together, and I will be trying my best to bring everyone together if I could. Yeah, the last one.
Great, thank you. So Vicky's taking on a mission to transform Taiwan as of the end of this call. And I think that brings us back to a common theme that we heard in the discussion, which is around collaboration, strengthening cooperation across sectors, potentially across markets to strengthen regional collaboration, and gives us an interesting pathway, potential growth driver to look at for next year's report. So I think with that, we've run a little bit over time, but thank you for all of those who stayed with us online. Really enjoyed this discussion, and together looking at the huge growth opportunities for both wind energy and workforce needs, and the human aspect of the transition in APAC. If you do have any questions around the report, please contact Global Wind Organization or GWEC. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your weeks. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.